Well, hey, did I just speak to you about my daughter?
No.
Okay. I just spoke to someone about my daughter. I think she's going through some sort of episode or something, but she's naked out in the yard. I need someone to come.
Okay, what's the address?
I am with Detective Jeremy Hinson today, and I am excited to talk to him for a couple of reasons. I went through a traumatic event, as many people know in our community, as a caregiver and family member of a loved one with serious mental illness. I work with our local NAMI, which serves Planning District 16 in the state of Virginia, and help a lot of people in the community that are going through similar situations. I also travel and serve as a panelist on all over for many different organizations, speaking of my story and advocating for caregivers and family members of those trying to support people through this journey. One part of my story that I have shied away from telling is my experience with Detective Henson. The other reason that I want to have this interview is to shed light on the fact that there is mass confusion around custody orders and how all of that is determined. And the number one call I get on a daily basis is, why didn't someone do more? And I know in my own circumstances, I had to really dig deep because I was once that person that said, why is this not happening for them? Or why is it not going a certain way? And I went out there and just spent the last 5 years figuring out, like, why does this look this way? And, really discovered a lot and learned a lot. And I felt like the only way to share that is that if I was able to talk about that alongside somebody that had experience in law enforcement. And so I am so, so appreciative of you being here. You have no idea. When my process first started, after your involvement with us, I wanted to shut the doors and close the blinds and hope that nobody found out. And what I learned over time was that was not going to help me. It was not going to help anyone else. And so I felt like the more I started talking about it, the more I would have people in the community that would say, oh, I've been going through X, Y, and Z, but I haven't told anyone and I don't really know how to handle this. And so, they would kind of glean from my story. The more I also told my story, the easier my story became. And then it kind of transformed me, not only through healing, but also in realizing that I can tackle big things, which I think a lot of people don't know, that if you've never experienced serious mental illness, I don't think they understand the depth of that. And I can tackle these things in my life and I can claim them, I can own them, and I can just be who I am and not worry about what people would think. One of the reasons I will say going into this that I was very hesitant to do this is because I'm a person that doesn't like to draw attention to myself, and you happen to be in an area that draws a lot of attention for positive and negative reasons. So,
right.
I knew by putting myself out there and saying, hey, this is my story, this is my thought process in all of this, and just trying to give people a different perspective, it's obviously going to bring criticism. So I had to be prepared for that. And also, like I said in the beginning, this was the 5 years in the making. I couldn't have done this interview with you 3 years ago. I would have not been able to get through it emotionally. And so with that said, I'm going to let you tell a little bit about your background, what your current job is, what drew you to law enforcement. We'll start there.
All right. Well, I've been in law enforcement for about a little over 27 years now. I originally applied and started working in Fairfax County Police Department in Northern Virginia. It's a large agency, and I worked there initially on patrol and then went into narcotics and did undercover work there for about 6 years. After that, I went into the Major Crimes Bureau, where it was primarily crimes against persons. And I started in the child abuse squad, which handled child sexual and physical abuse, which is pretty challenging. And then I went on from there to sex crimes of adults and on to homicide and cold case. So I retired there in 2020 and I came to Stafford. And I was working patrol in 2021, I believe it was 2021, when I met you and a family member. since then, I became a detective again here with Stafford. And then, after some time and a couple short little breaks from the agency, I returned back to being a detective. And now I'm the supervisor of the Special Victims Unit and the Domestic Violence Unit. So, kind of coming back to supervision of investigations where my investigations kind of started. I'm also a Marine Corps veteran. I did 6 years in the Marine Corps before I came into law enforcement. And, I think the thing that drew me to law enforcement was I had a lot of personal experiences with family members who pretty much sidetracked or ruined their lives, for lack of a better term. And it was all, I think, attributed eventually and in the end to like illegal drug addictions and substance abuse. So I think I came to law enforcement with the initial sense of attacking that problem as a way of helping. And it was a learning experience, to say the least, and to get some reality to my ideals. um, and I think I really figured out why I was in law enforcement when I started working in the Major Crimes Bureau in Fairfax, and then eventually came here because I think being able to help people directly versus an indirect method was what really kind of pulled me into this field.
It's funny because you brought up coming from Fairfax to our area, and I'll never forget, at the time when you're with me in those hours, you're trying to, just kind of normalize as you can. And you were talking about that it was refreshing because I think we were in sort of a political firestorm with law enforcement at the time. How do you handle society's view of you just being part of law enforcement over the years whenever there's things like that going on?
Yeah, I gotta say, the start of my career was very different from the end and about the time that I met you. Um, Being in law enforcement during 9/11, people who were alive back then understand, but it was very much a rally around the flag, rally around, the people who were service oriented. So I was blessed with either just that's the way it was, and everyone loved the fact that law enforcement was there, the military was there, and people were going to do things that might not be pleasant, but the overall goal was the benefit of society or people. So there were a lot of happy times, good times, people just rallying behind you. And then, you know, fast forward to George Floyd, and I really think that was like the critical turning point. And while there may have been people who felt certain ways, like that happening really led to a groundswell and traction for the movement of, defund the police, or the police aren't there to help, or the government's bad, and all these things. So, when you think about it, 2026 really isn't that far away. It's gotten better, but I got to tell you, it was pretty bad in Fairfax, and part of that negativity and difficulty in doing your job without community support led me to retire as soon as I could retire.
Yeah.
And come to a community like Stafford where it was traditionally more supportive of law enforcement. So I came here, and I'll never forget, my first day driving a Mark Cruiser home. I was a detective for all these years, and now I was back in patrol, and just driving a Mark Cruiser home and having people in neighborhoods, wave and smile when they saw you. And it was just like I had been transported to either back in time or a different world. It still wasn't perfect, even then. I think I'm still kind of learning how to process it. It's kind of hard to do some of the self-sacrifice and sacrifice that your family has to endure because of the job you've chosen when there isn't like that groundswell support. So I wish I had a clear-cut answer. It is tough. It is challenging. People struggle in different ways, and cops, they're all human too. So, you have some people that self-medicate with alcohol, some people who don't know how to deal with it and have trouble staying in the profession. And even today, we haven't quite come fully back. I can tell you it's hard to staff police agencies all around the country, not even here where it's better. So I don't know if I have the perfect coping mechanism for it, but I do try to engage people with discussion that's not like equally fiery, just to try to get to know people, remind people that just like I'm a cop, I'm also a person. Just like you may be having your worst day, you're still a person. If we can find some connection, hopefully we can get through rhetoric and perceptions that really aren't rooted in reality either direction. Just because you live in a bad neighborhood doesn't make you a bad person. Just because a bad cop is viral on social media or the news, it doesn't mean all cops are bad. So, we have to find our common ground. And I just try to do that through talking with people and getting to know them and making those connections.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's one element of the whole, we forget, and that was one thing I thought about when coming up with things to talk about here, is that we forget that law enforcement, firefighters, sometimes even teachers are humans.
Yes.
And we're so quick to forget that and just say, just so-called do your job, but there's like a whole thing to that. And so coming back to my story a little bit, I remember I did not want law enforcement in my home. And, that's because at the time that I had to make the call for my daughter, I truly had no idea what to expect. I'm calling, I'm saying that someone is delusional. I didn't know that she was delusional at the time, but that's essentially what I was saying. I couldn't answer anything. I couldn't answer if she was a harm to anyone. I couldn't answer anything. So I knew in the back of my mind, they have to come in and they've got to figure this situation out. I'm telling them that I have other minor children in the home. And so when I first called, I asked for a non-emergency number, and they gave it to me. And by the time I got off the phone, she was out in the yard with no clothes on. And so I was like, I don't have a choice anymore. I have to call back. I need help. Like, I don't know what to do with this. And so I called back and I kept telling the operator, I please, like, they have to come in a certain way because I have kids upstairs. I don't want this to be traumatic. I don't know what to do. I couldn't tell her one way or another what my daughter was going to do. I could only guess. And I'll never forget to this day when I heard you announce yourself entering our home. My immediate thought was, who the heck has come over during this time? Like, my brain was racing, like trying to figure it out, because it was so like a family member walking in.
Okay.
And then you announced it again, and I'm like, hello, we're here. And I remember you came around the corner and I was like, what? Because it was like a neighbor coming over. And I know that's not for everyone. And I know that doesn't happen everywhere. I get that. And please let me clarify that. I get it. But the way that you came in and was just you were so calm and so collected, as if like you were just checking in to see if things were okay, I truly think changed how that whole thing went. I really believe that. I don't know that it would have escalated any worse than that, but it definitely made sure that it didn't get any worse by the way that was approached. And you had another deputy with you. I think he was a deputy at the time. I'm bad with these names and titles, but
Yeah.
he was the same exact way. We had to be separated, and you're in there talking to my daughter, I'm in the other room, and my mind is spinning. And I remember hearing stories over the years of like people saying that when they were spoken to, there was like this, they felt like they were in a tunnel and they were moving further. And I'll never forget, you came in and you're like standing so close to me, and you're like, I have to take her. And I was like, okay. But then you kept saying a bunch of stuff, but I was like, I was moving back in that tunnel. And I
Right.
remember thinking, which is which is silly now coming on the other side. But I remember thinking, oh no, don't let this be my decision. You know, how many caregivers and family members wish that it was their decision? but, and you were like, no, no, this is not your decision.
Right.
And you flat out, you looked at me and you were so calm and so empathetic. And you said, your daughter believes that you have put metal body parts inside of her. And when you said that, it was like, I didn't need to know anything else.
Yeah.
And, you know, naive to the whole situation, I believed that for some reason, even though she was over 18, that I had to come sign something. And so you're like, no, there's no hurry. I'm like racing, not even showered, trying to get to the hospital. Um, so what I would love to do at this point in time is explain. I know in different states it's called different things. If you could just explain like ECOs,
Yeah.
TDOs, how those work, and you know, kind of just briefly outline what happens when the decision is made.
Yeah. And if it's okay, but before we transition to that, I'd just like to say something. Um, I want you to take some credit for the way we responded because even though you were an emotional overload, your concern for your daughter, you conveyed that you were concerned about how our response might escalate her or how she would respond to it. So we met outside, my sergeant at the time and another deputy, and we decided to go very low key, low, like in your face type of a soft contact because you had left directions. Hey, come in this way. I've got this door open. I've got kids upstairs. So you gave us the safety information that we needed before we came in there. So we were able to come in there. So I would just tell anyone who may have a law enforcement contact in the future, the best information was like what you gave. I'm afraid of a reaction from a big approach. I have children on this level. I'm on this level. This is the where I'd like you to come in. You provided that to us and may not even remember going through that with the operator, but you did. They relayed it to us, and that really helped us come up with a good approach. And oftentimes, not to change a lot of the things that we do, but oftentimes that approach, you lose the good approach and it's hard to come back from that. So I just want to give you some credit. Whether you realize what you're doing or not, you provided the information that gave us the tools to make this a better outcome.
Thank you. If you could just walk us through briefly, it doesn't have to be in detail, but what an ECO is. I remember being for the longest time ECO, TDO, like I have no idea what the difference of the two is. You know, the eight in the state, I know they're different in different states, but in the state of Virginia, we have like the 8-hour hold, the 72-hour hold, and then it goes on further than that. If you could just briefly explain those as it pertains to your involvement.
Yeah. So an ECO is the temporary ability for a member of law enforcement or even a citizen can go to a magistrate and provide these facts, and a magistrate can issue this ECO, or an officer can basically call the ECO when they've talked to either a family member or witnessed things that they believe this person is experiencing a mental health crisis or is a person in crisis of some level. And we're not medical or psychiatric professionals, but we can do the bright line rule. Is this person able to care for themselves? Are they a harm to themselves? Are they a potential harm to someone else? And so when we get that information, we'll call what's called the ECO, emergency custody order. And that gives us 8 hours in which to get that person to a facility. And in Stafford, Mary Washington Hospital has a mental health unit. So when we take a person into this 8-hour hold for an ECO, we will then make contact with RACSB, which is a Rappahannock Area Community Services Board, which manages, I would say, all but the private mental health treatment for the area, this greater area of Stafford, Fredericksburg. We call that person. We speak to an on-duty mental health provider, professional. We give them the information, and they say, okay, I'm going to send the information over to the mental health unit. Continue to Mary Washington Hospital with your person. We get to the hospital, and we'll get that person medically cleared first through the ER, and then we'll go to the mental health unit. So when we're at the mental health unit, that is where the process to determine if a TDO, a temporary detention order, is going to be issued occurs. And that's where, when you met me in the hospital, that's what was starting that process. So before I go into too much on the TDO, the ECO is 8 hours. It can be extended up to 4 hours if there's things outside of people's control, such as volume, bed space, just different things. And it can get very busy at that mental health unit because it services all the greater area around Fredericksburg. So it can get really busy, and you can have 3-4 different law enforcement agencies in there with people that are going through that process. So once you get to the hospital on the ECO, you'll either have an in-person or a telemed engagement where the patient will then speak to the mental health professional directly or through telemed, whereas before the ECO, it's just the officer speaking to them and giving the facts and everything. They'll evaluate them. They'll determine if this is a situation where they can be either admitted to voluntary treatment or whether they need a TDO. And the TDO is going to be good for 72 hours. And it's typically going to result in a placement if a bed can be found in a local place, such as Snowden, sometimes Dominion, sometimes Western State, which are full service psychiatric facilities and mental health treatment centers. Whereas the mental health unit is really more of an ER holding area for this. There, if you're on ACO, you're held until that TDO is issued, and it should be issued within those 12 hours. Sometimes they'll put a temporary hold on it, but the TDO gets issued, and then the person will be transferred for those up to 3 days, which will be longer if it's a holiday or a weekend. Like it can last longer if the TDO was set to expire on a day that another evaluation for additional more long-term care couldn't happen, if that makes sense. So it could start as a 3-day, but because it ends on after business hours on the weekend, it might extend to that Monday, where a doctor can go, look, this person needs more, or this person can transition to voluntary services, just depending on what the situation is. Some mental health crises can be induced with medical issues, or they can appear to be a mental issue when maybe it's really just a medical issue, such as variations in their, minerals, potassium, different things like that. So that gives them time to sort through all that and hopefully get the person plugged in to care. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of the TDO ECO differences. The ECO is the temporary law enforcement, and then the TDO gets issued if the psychiatric professional, sorry, I'm using that term probably a little too loosely, if the mental health professional and the magistrate both agree that this is what needs to happen, and then you will not be able to leave during the time that TDO is in place. You're virtually in the custody of the facility.
Yeah. And so, from your perspective, what I didn't understand, and this is where I'll get into when I got to the hospital, I'll never forget, you didn't know this part, but I got to the door, and again, I don't know why I thought I was signing something for over 18. I just was not in my right mind. And
Right.
so I get up to the little desk, and I'm like, my daughter was brought here. This is the deputy's name. He said to show up here. And so he just hands me a badge, and I still have that sticker badge to this day.
Yeah.
And he handed me that badge, and I looked at him naively, and I said, "What do you want me to do with this?" And he said,
Right.
"Go to the room." I said, "She doesn't want to see me." He said, "Well, are you the family member?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, I guess I gotta, I'm thinking in my head, you gotta face this. You just gotta go to the room."
Yeah.
What I didn't expect is I'm walking down this hallway. My heart is like out of my chest. because I don't know what I'm coming across. And I come to this room. Here's my daughter. She's handcuffed to a bed. She still has all of this like sugar scrub all over her because she got out of the
Yes.
shower and didn't finish washing it off.
I'll
And
never
then
forget that.
I see you sitting there, and I'm
Yeah.
like, why, in layman's term, why is the cop in the room? What is happening? And then
Yes.
I'm like, there's this little room, and I'll never forget you apologized as a kind of like a jokey way. And you said,
Mm.
well, Spotsy had already taken the bigger room. So here we
Yeah.
are. So there's these two chairs, and you've got this laptop on your lap. And I remember sitting down, and I just could not process what was happening in my life at that moment. My daughter was talking to someone in the ceiling, and I'm sitting there thinking, why does this man have to sit in this room and endure this, not
Yeah.
understanding the process? And
Right.
then, as we're sitting there over hours and hours and hours, which I believe that in my situation, it was a little delayed. It was coming off of a holiday. And there was just a lot of people. I remember at one point I asked you, is this some sort of, I was very confused. Like, and you were like, no, it was the 4th of July.
Yep, that's right.
I was like, all right. But
Yeah.
I think for me, because I think the reason that you had the most impact on my story was not only the way you handled things in our home, but those hours sitting in that room. I honestly don't know if I would have been able to, and I've said this a lot of times over the years, I don't know if I would have been able to endure it if you hadn't have been there. First of all, my daughter had massive delusions against me. They were very, very great, and they were very tragic.
Mm.
And a lot of the things she was saying in that room, I remember she wanted me arrested so much that my brain started, and I've always said, oh, I'm one of those people that can never be brainwashed. But my brain started questioning had I had done something that I like didn't know I had done. And I
Yeah.
thought, and I remember saying back to myself, this is crazy, like, no, don't, just stop. And then I remember there's a one point I was like, well, maybe to make her happy, they should just arrest me and then they can go through a whole investigation or something. I don't know. She was demanding a sonogram. I remember trying to pay
Mm.
for a sonogram just to make her be quiet. And they were
Right.
like, no. and so, and so I was trying everything. But in that room, you know, as a parent, you're sitting there and you're essentially, all I kept thinking was, I don't know this person. My daughter's brain is so broken. It's so broken. And I remember you were trying to relate to her. And at the time I was thinking in my head, like, what is he doing? Her brain is so broken. Like, why is he saying this? And,
Yeah.
later on, obviously I appreciated it after the fact. But in the moment I was like, this is just so much. And there were times she had to go to the restroom and she didn't want me near her. And I remember, you get up and you help her to the restroom, you help her come back. And I'm thinking, what kid or what person ever in a million years, says I want to be in law enforcement and ever envisions that they're in this role right here.
Yes.
And it was really eye-opening for me because I probably have been guilty over the years of being like, well, why didn't they do this or why didn't they do that? And as family members and caregivers, we face that a lot with our own families and people in the community. They're like, well, if I would have been dealing with this, I hear it all the time. Or let's say, you try to instill boundaries with a family member and then you say you can no longer be in my home. Well, then it's, well, mom or dad or whoever essentially made this person homeless. Or if you allow them in the home and there's chaos going on, it's, well, look at what's being enabled. And there's just never really a win. And what I started noticing is that that's done to family members and caregivers, but we do it as a society to law enforcement. It's never a win.
No.
And I'm sure there are times, there's moments, but it's like, we talk more about what is not happening than what is happening. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this, because I sat in that room and I could have easily started complaining about a multitude of things. But I started thinking, how grateful am I that this person, even though it's his duty, yes, he has to be sitting here, he has no choice, he's stuck in this room with us. how grateful am I that someone um, is here with me that can endure this with me, because I don't know if I would have been able to do it alone. It was it was such an emotional impact on me that I remember for a long time I would pass patrol cars and I would think of you. There was a time that I was trying to get my daughter's car fixed, and you had pulled up, and I'm seeing you, and we're walking, and we're almost to the door, and I had to turn around, and I went to my car and I bawled because I just couldn't bring myself to be in the same room with you again, because that's how much of an impact you had on us, or had on me, in that setting and situation. And yes, there's a lot of people out there that are going to say he's just a good one, or he was just doing his job. And that may be true, but I think I'm not in the room with other deputies and officers too, and these things may be happening in those rooms too. And I think we just don't talk about it enough because we're so consumed as family members and caregivers with what's going on with our loved one and what's not being done properly, that we forget to think about the things that are going on, that are working. And this is definitely one of them. And I realize that not everyone has my experience. And I know that a lot of times I feel like, just in the peer work I do, it's easy to target law enforcement because they're right there. Caregivers and family members are always pushed off with HIPAA. It's always just go, we can't talk to you, but they're always left with the mess at the end. And then, you have this officer or this deputy right in front of you, and it's much easier to say, well, this person was right here, they didn't do enough. So speaking to that, aside from like cases that involve misconduct, can you help explain, or can you explain how sometimes blame can be misplaced due to us as citizens not understanding the system and the processes that are involved in some of these things? And not so much getting into harm to self or harm to others, because I want to touch base on that a little bit later. But you really are bound by your agency, or is it, just federal? Is it agency? How does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a duty to intervene, to protect, life. Oftentimes, tactics can look worse than they necessarily are. Unless someone's had training, it might look heavy-handed, or might look like the wrong move, or it might look too soon. But the longer you've done the job, the quicker you can recognize things like pre-assaultive behavior, and it might look innocent to someone standing there who may interpret what happened as everything was fine and those officers jumped on that poor person who was clearly suffering. And, the faster we can intercede in those actions, the safer the outcome we can have. So in the land of cell phone videos, body cam footage, and things like that, I guess the things that are most important to, I guess, law enforcement and like in my profession is, you may have a video, but that may not have captured like the flavor of that. You're compressing a 3D interaction into a 2D or a 1D format, right? And it's hard to understand without training, and doing role play for like mental health persons in crisis, or doing takedown training. It can look very different to someone who's not done that. And sometimes a person has a weapon, and if there's law enforcement involved, if a law enforcement officer gets overpowered, guess who now has weapons? So oftentimes you will see like multiple law enforcement work to subdue a person, whether they've committed a violation of the law or they're in a crisis, if it looks like it's going to over boil. So most people see multiple people on a single person and automatically assume, almost back to playground rules, that something unfair or untowards is happening. So, without talking about our duties to intervene on self harm or harm of others, that's about the best explanation I think I can give for that. Um, you know,
And
there's a
that
lot of bad
really,
videos out there that have, the proper training and tactics applied.
yeah, and that really leads me into after my daughter's first hospitalization, you know, she got out and we were right back at square one. But there was a difference in my thought process because I truly believed in having just 3 weeks understanding of it. But I truly believed that had I called again, she would not be taken in again. And this is what I try to tell family and caregivers, you may get that sweet spot where things just kind of work perfectly when you have law enforcement right there on you. But I'll tell you, I would have never gotten her taken in again without her volunteering to go, simply because she was highly delusional. She was still hallucinating. However, she had already been through that experience once. So she would have easily known. And I always like to talk about like psychosis being on autopilot because there are elements to it that can essentially they can pull themselves together. And I feel like she would have handled herself in subsequent calls enough to the point that she wouldn't have met criteria to be able to be taken in. And that is one of the biggest struggles that family members have, is that, and I was guilty of this back in the day. I'm thinking this person lived this life, had this career, had this college education, and now suddenly they're homeless on the streets. And to me, like other family members, it's like, well, that is a harm to self, but it's not. I mean, legally, you're allowed to be homeless, unfortunately. And it took me a long time to kind of come to to grip with that, because I was just like, it's hard for me to understand as a family member because I'm seeing the harm that's being done. And so, can you touch base just a little bit on needing to be a harm to themselves or a harm to others? And also alluding to the fact that law enforcement have a snippet on that call. They have a snippet of time that they are sitting in front of that individual, whereas we have a long history and a long, rapport, and things are said to us more so than they're going to be said to law enforcement.
Yeah. So oftentimes, our biggest indicator to take someone in is that they're a harm to another person. If they make statements of self harm, that's wonderful. But oftentimes, they're very vague statements, and you almost have to have that family member telling you what that means when you're hearing terminology to attribute some things to a self harm. So those are the big ones that we use: self harm, harm to others. Some self harm, just like you alluded to, not caring for yourself by refusing to live indoors, while harmful, is probably not going to ever result in a person being held, because in this country people have certain freedoms and a lot of people just won't get in the way of that. So I think that families being able to provide details to law enforcement helps in that snapshot judgment. It won't always be someone is actively harming a person. It won't always be they're actively harming themselves. In fact, I think those are in the minority of the calls that we handle. Typically, it's I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be a burden to anyone, or behavioral things such as abandoning all their lively possessions and making some vague statement alluding to the world to be better without them. Those are things we evaluate in our decision. And I will tell you, law enforcement is frustrated oftentimes because I don't know how to say this properly, but it seems like there's a lot of people who are mental health patients or have history that are highly intelligent. And I don't think that goes hand in hand per se, but I will tell you, they learn.
Mm-hmm.
And while they might not get through my thought process or one of my peers' thought processes about the emergency custody order, I can tell you by the time things settle down and they're in a hospital bed having their interview for this TDO with the mental health professional, they are often telling them the things that they know they can say to either mitigate this or make promises that they'll do better about taking care or seeking follow-up treatment. The amount of ECOs that get dissolved on a person that you're like, I know we're going to be back out there. You know, the mental health profession is overwhelmed with patients, not enough professionals, not enough bed space, and we often chase the ECO basically, you know, on repeats. And I'm kind of getting off topic, but I think
No,
that's
it just
huge to keep in
reminded
mind.
it reminded me too. I remember being terrified in that room that they were going to come in and then something was going to change, and then I was thinking,
Yeah,
what am I going to do? Like, what? She's not going to get brought back in because she's not going to do anything. She's going to want to get away from that, and it's such a stressful time because you just don't know like how it's gonna go. You're constantly waiting hour by hour by hour, and then you have the whole other side as a mother. You know, I'm sitting there. You know, I remember the facility calling me and they said we're gonna wait 72 hours and see if this clears up, and it's like, though you know she needs the help and 72 hours comes and goes and they're like, oh no, this is more long term. You're devastated that it's more long term, so you have to grieve that. But then you're also relieved because she's where she needs to be and not in my house.
right.
And so there's just so many elements to that. And I think too, because like I said before, we have access in front of us sometimes to law enforcement. It's easier in those moments of those initial hours to be like, why didn't you do more? Or you know, when they don't get taken. You know, I've had people in the community that, you know, filed complaints and I'm like, just decided that I don't know, like their hands were tied, like, and I don't even say that lightly. I'm smiling about it because I've been on that side. I know what it feels like. I know how discouraging it is. I know what it's like to not know how I'm going to get help for my daughter. Knowing that I knew there was no law enforcement that was going to be able to take her in, but she desperately needed help in subsequent times past that first hospitalization. But I think people don't realize how much the officer or the deputy's hands are just as tied, oftentimes as a family member's hands are tied by things
Yeah.
that are bigger than that. And it's interesting you brought up the 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 role playing, because one of the things that I got involved in was CIT International, and I took a CIT law enforcement training, and I was the only one in the room out of like 40 something people that wasn't law enforcement. So that was definitely eye opening because I was like an oddball out on that side, but
Right.
it was so good to see, like when we did the role playing, there were officers and deputies in the room that genuinely wanted to understand, but they had been taught like such a certain protocol. And so they would stop in the middle of the role playing and they would say, wait, what am I supposed to say now? Because they were trying
Yes.
so hard, but it was so
Yes.
ingrained in a certain
Right.
way. And I
Yeah.
thought, wow, like this is crazy watching how, you know, they really do want to do it in a certain way, but this is the way that it's always been, and we're changing the way. And you can allude to this better than me, but I feel like over time, how we've handled calls and stuff has changed.
Yes.
And so it's like you're doing this whole new learning curve. And
Mhm.
yeah. So if you could just speak to anything that you know about CIT or yeah.
Well, I think that a lot of agencies were getting into CIT when they had a high population, like in Fairfax, Northern Virginia Mental Health was there. So there was a CIT program there before, like, Marcus Alert came around and started dictating that agencies have to come up with ways in which to better handle these calls for persons in crisis. So I think that it is really critical to have that. the only unfortunate thing is you might not always get a full-time CIT member responding, right? So oftentimes it might be a train the trainer type of a thing where the person who's the CIT on the CIT team is teaching everyone else the best that they can teach them and giving them the best newer protocols and approaches. But anything is better than nothing, right? And I'll tell you that our agency and a lot are making great strides now. Like we've recently incorporated a mental health unit. We have a co-responder who is a mental health professional who will go out on calls with a person from the mental health unit, in addition to the patrol deputies who get dispatched. That's if it even is something that needs law enforcement. The dispatchers are screening the calls and determining, is this someone I could send to RACSB? Is this someone that I can find a mobile crisis team that's just mental health care providers, civilians, not cops, coming and talking to someone who may not have transportation but might have needs? So there's a lot of things that are happening now in addition to the CIT. I think CIT was our first step forward, and I think it's here to stay. And I'm glad to see it now. I believe it's mandatory 40-hour course. I'm pretty sure you sat through that 40-hour course if you were doing it with other officers. And people go to that in large part because they don't want to have that negative interaction, and anything they can do, any tactics they can learn to mitigate something going south, they want to take that, because they don't want to have anyone get hurt. They don't want to get hurt themselves. So I think that this is definitely a team that is accepted by law enforcement, at least all the ones I've had contact with in this area, and things that I hear. So I'm glad to see it. I think it's super important. And I typically based my involvement and interactions with my life experiences, like as a parent, as a cop, as military, as just someone who's engaged with people enough to know that oftentimes if you just treat someone how you would want yourself or a family member treated, you can almost make up for some deficiencies in skill. It doesn't mean it won't go bad, and it can't go bad. But yeah, I guess that's a long-winded answer. I think
No,
that
it
I
was
could
good.
stand by on that. There's probably a lot more detail in the CIT, but it's been many years since I've had my basics with CIT, so I don't want to speak on something that I don't like fully employ the principles and protocols for
Yeah.
day to day.
And I know, and that was one of the things I never knew if you had been trained in CIT. But after I took the CIT training, I was like, maybe that's just, I don't know, maybe he had the training.
I
Because,
definitely had some. It
okay,
was
that makes
I
sense.
wasn't on the team, but I had the training in Northern
That makes
Virginia.
sense.
But
So go ahead.
not only I think has the Marcus Alert led to a lot of growth. Like we now do, our agency and other agencies do collaborations with fire and rescue at their different localities. So our fire department now has soft restraints, and they can transport people to the hospital, and it doesn't have to be handcuffed in the back of a police car. It it gives like an advance intake into the medical screening portion of what has to happen, and frankly I don't think that it has the stigma, and the soft restraints are easier on a person in crisis. They're not going to hurt themselves fighting the restraints, and then they can do like a hot handoff to us and the medical professionals at the facility. That's been a huge improvement. And in a worst case scenario, the fire and rescue can do sedations as part of the medical care so that a person can try to get out of that highly agitated state.
Well,
So I think those are,
the handcuffs is a huge thing in our community. It's the biggest complaint that I'm like, I can't believe, and until people started saying it, I really people that I've actually spoken to that have been handcuffed and those,
Mhm.
they've been psychotic, they've
Yeah.
been having symptoms and all of that. And, they're really against it. And I never really thought about it from that angle. I will say in my own personal situation, you said I do need to let you know that I do have to handcuff her. And
Okay.
I had zero feelings about that from my perspective because to me it just kind of made sense. I didn't, my daughter could have took off running and then you guys had to tackle her to the asphalt is what I'm thinking in my head. I know
Yeah.
her when she gets emotionally charged. And
Mhm.
so for me, I wasn't thinking anything, but I'll tell you, when I heard you tell her about putting handcuffs on her and I was in the other room. And I think that was the most devastating element for me is not that she was getting handcuffs. It's that she had no reaction. And I knew then, I knew by her non-reaction, she was sick.
Yeah.
I knew that we were doing the right thing because um, my daughter historically she would have melted about that. And so when I heard no reaction, I just was like, oh man, this is not good from that perspective. But yes, I had no idea how much that's a huge thing in the community. And I mean, I get it. I get it. I get that if your loved one is seriously mentally ill or going through a mental health crisis and they're not a criminal and, handcuffing them essentially is, treating them like a criminal. And I understand that, but I guess I also have always seen the other side of that because I feel like even if my daughter wasn't going to do anything criminal wise, even running and having to be tackled onto the asphalt would be traumatizing as well.
Yeah.
So, that's something that I've always thought of from my perspective.
Yeah. And and talking about this now, probably a great point to be included with perception versus protocols, right? That we had talked about earlier. Most people will attribute seeing someone in handcuffs as that person's bad, they've done something wrong. If you're in a mental health crisis, even if you did something that was bad per se or something wrong, it's not that you did that with any intent. You did it because, like you said, that's my daughter, but that wasn't her.
Mm-hmm.
That person's not in their right mind, clearly. So, you know, if a person's calm, I like to tell them, hey, I have to put you in these, because I don't want that happening to them to be a surprise and to them not have the chance, even if they're not in their right mind, to prepare themselves that they're about to be restricted. If a person is violent or scary at that moment, we're probably not telling them. And it's going to look ugly because it's going to be like you know, it's going to be a show getting handcuffs on someone who doesn't want to be handcuffed, especially if they're in crisis. Because when you're in crisis, your body's not listening to pain receptors and you are really strong because your body's shutting down fight or flight things. So, you know, I like to tell them, just like I like to tell the parents or their caregiver or their significant other, we're about to put this person in handcuffs, not because they did anything wrong, but that's just, we have to do this so that we can transport them safely and they can't hurt themselves and they can't hurt me. So looking at that from the outside in, it doesn't look the same as what the reasons behind it are. So now it's so nice to be able to, like, you know what, we can call fire department and put you on a
Yeah.
stretcher. You don't even realize that straps are in place the way they do it. I'm not going to say sometimes we don't have to put someone in the straps unwillingly. We've trained with the fire department for that as well. But at least when we get them there, I think they're in a better place physically and hopefully in the long run, looking back, when they recall certain pieces of their interaction, hopefully they can see that it was the best that it could be, I guess, even though they didn't want to have their freedom taken away,
Yeah.
temporarily.
Well, I so appreciate your time with me in doing this. I think that it's helped, and I think that anyone listening to it could easily see angles that they historically would not have seen. And I think it's so important, like I said it early on, coming from somebody in law enforcement versus just coming from me. You know, a lot of reason I don't talk about my story is because majority of the times I'm going to hear you just, like I said before, you just got someone good. your situation turned out great, whatever. And that's not true. I've thought a lot about it over the years. As this portion of my story with law enforcement involvement, would I have been bitter if you would have looked at me and said, there's nothing I can do for you? I don't think I would have been. I think that I would have understood it to be that you were working within a box and she didn't fit in that box. And it's the same thing on our end as family members and caregivers. We have a box and some things work in them and some things don't. And it's the same thing for the hospital. It's the same thing for the facility. It's the same thing for anyone that's coming in contact with this journey. And I feel like there's, just so much said about telling or saying how law enforcement could do X, Y, and Z and this and that. It's a huge, huge part of people's stories. And I feel like we're not taking it in all angles, and I know people will hate me. They're going to hate me for saying that. But it's the truth. It's everybody's got a duty. We can't, there may be bad apples on that side, but it doesn't mean that everyone's doing it that way. And it doesn't mean that if it didn't work in your favor, it's because that person was a bad apple either. So, I mean, I think we have to take that into consideration. And then just in closing, is there anything else that you can think of? I know I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't prepare you for this, but anything that you can think of that, you could say to us as community members, as family members, as caregivers, dealing in these, very chaotic and stressful times. Because the one thing that I have learned in my 5 years is that, I know there's different reasons you can be taken on a hold, substance use, other mental health challenges, but, I only have experience in serious mental illness. And when it comes to serious mental illness, it's a family illness. It takes over the whole family. In some way or fashion, it affects every person in that family, in that immediate family that's residing with that person. And so is there anything that you can say from your side as it relates to, I mean, I know we've gone over a lot of this, but just these mental health calls in general?
Yeah. I mean, I would recommend find out who your local group is, like with Stafford and Greater Fredericksburg, RACSB. Lean on them as a resource. Get in contact with them. If your agency has a mental health unit, the agency that provides law enforcement services to your jurisdiction, get in touch with the mental health unit. Our sergeant of the mental health unit takes phone calls all day, goes out, talks to people all the time. It's not just ECO and transporting people. It's education. It's suggestions. Not any one mental health situation is going to be a boilerplate template. Just like your situation was this way, you could have a situation so vastly different with so many different things in play, or maybe it's a situation that's, made worse by substance abuse or substance use. So lean on your resources. If you can get something addressed before the crisis point, that's the best way to do it. Because if it doesn't get addressed at the crisis point, you're going to be limited to how that situation devolves, and neither party may have much choice based on when it devolves. And sometimes it just has to be during the crisis point. Sometimes that's when it happens, and that's when you deal with it. The mental health is a tough thing to address, and is vastly overwhelmed. And, unfortunately, people are trying to carry a lot for too long. And there's a lot of people that need help that are loved ones, and also people who need treatment. So lean on your resources is my best advice.
I love that. And I hope to meet with you in person just so I can give you a hug.
Yes.
Aside from this, but I'm
Yes.
deeply grateful for you doing this for the community. It's not just for me, it's for a lot of people out there struggling. They're struggling in silence. They're not speaking out like I am, but having resources just like this and just hearing it from somebody who has experience in it does make a world of a difference. Because I can tell you, as a family member, we spend a lot of hours just searching on Google looking for things like this.
Right. And
So,
I'm a layman in this field, right? I apply this when need be. Like we have some very vetted, very well vetted experts on the mental health unit, and the co-responder is a wealth for our agency, and I know a lot of people are moving to that. So, some people might laugh at it, but I think they're a wealth of knowledge and experience to bring to the table.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And
You got it.
I look forward to seeing you soon.
All right. It was great seeing you, and thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.